History loves talking about conquerors who built empires with swords and blood. But what about the man who conquered hearts and minds with pure, overwhelming generosity? What happens when someone becomes so wealthy that their very presence destroys entire economies? Not through war, but through kindness. This is the story of Mansa Musa, a West African emperor who became the richest human being in recorded history, yet used his unimaginable wealth not to build monuments to himself, but to give it all away. A man so generous that he single-handedly crashed the gold market across 3 continents for an entire decade. Wait, what? Yes, you heard that right. One person's charity caused international economic chaos that lasted 10 years. But here's the real question that will haunt this entire story. When you possess wealth beyond imagination, does giving it away make you the most generous soul who ever lived, or the most dangerous economic force in human history? How does a devoutly religious king from the heart of Africa become so powerful that his name echoes through European courts, Middle Eastern markets, and appears on medieval maps as a legend made flesh? Picture the world in 1324. Europe is crawling out of the Dark Ages, still recovering from famines and plagues. The Crusades have ended, but the economic networks they created are thriving. Gold is the universal currency of power, and whoever controls it controls trade routes, armies, and the fate of nations. But while European kings scrape together enough gold to mint a few coins, deep in West Africa, in the Empire of Mali, sits a man who literally doesn't know how to count his wealth, because no number system has been invented that's large enough. This isn't just another story about a rich king. This is about the moment when 2 worlds collided: the Islamic world of scholarship, trade, and pilgrimage, and the African empire that had been quietly accumulating more gold than the rest of the world combined. When these forces met along the pilgrimage route to Mecca, the economic shockwaves would ripple across continents and reshape global commerce forever. In 1324, Mansa Musa made a decision that would change everything. Not a decision to wage war or conquer territory or build monuments, but a decision to walk. To walk 4,000 miles across the Sahara Desert to fulfill his religious duty as a Muslim and perform the Hajj to Mecca. What happened next would transform him from a regional king into a global legend, and prove that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a sword. It's a caravan loaded with so much gold that it defies comprehension. Musa Keita wasn't born to rule an empire. In the early 1300s, he was just another member of the royal family in Mali, watching from the sidelines as his brother, Mansa Abu Bakr II, sat on the golden throne of what was already the largest empire in Africa. But Abu Bakr had an obsession that would change Musa's destiny forever. He was convinced that if you sailed west across the Atlantic Ocean, you'd find new lands filled with gold and glory. Picture yourself in Mali's capital city around 1312. You're standing in a palace made of red clay and decorated with intricate geometric patterns, watching Abu Bakr pace back and forth, gesturing wildly at maps while his advisors shake their heads. This isn't some casual daydream. Abu Bakr has already sent out one expedition of 200 ships that never returned. Now he's planning to lead a second expedition himself, with 2,000 ships carrying supplies and 1,000 more carrying people. I will not return until I reach the other side of the ocean, or until I die trying, Abu Bakr declared to his court. His advisors pleaded with him to reconsider. Musa, his younger brother, quietly observed from the corner, knowing that if Abu Bakr left and never returned, the throne would fall to him. And that's exactly what happened. Abu Bakr sailed west in 1311 with his massive fleet, leaving Musa as regent. Months passed. Years passed. No word came back. The Atlantic Ocean had swallowed an emperor and 3,000 ships. leaving behind only legends and a crown that now belong to Musa. But here's what makes Musa extraordinary. Instead of seeing this as a tragic accident, he saw it as divine providence. When he accepted the throne in 1312, he didn't just inherit an empire, he inherited a responsibility to show the world what Islamic leadership could achieve. He transformed his brother's reckless adventure into his own disciplined vision. The Mali empire Musa inherited wasn't just large, it was impossibly vast, stretching from the Atlantic coast to the bend of the Niger River, covering territories that today include Mali, Senegal, Burkina Faso, Niger, Guinea, Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Mauritania, and parts of Ghana and Ivory Coast. But size means nothing without resources, and Musa had struck the ultimate lottery. His empire sat on top of the richest gold and salt deposits in the known world. The gold mines of Bambouk and Bouré produced more gold than anywhere else on Earth. The salt mines of Tagaza were equally valuable. In a world without refrigeration, salt was literally worth its weight in gold, sometimes more. Musa controlled both ends of this equation, making him the ultimate middleman in global commerce. But controlling wealth and managing it wisely are two different things. Musa's first triumph wasn't military, it was administrative genius. While European kingdoms struggled to maintain control over territories a few hundred miles across, Musa created a bureaucratic system that kept his massive empire unified and prosperous. He established provincial governors, standardized weights and measures, created a postal system that could deliver messages across thousands of miles, and most importantly, he made sure that trade routes remained safe and profitable. This wasn't just about accumulating wealth, it was about creating a civilization. Musa expanded Timbuktu from a small trading post into a world-class center of learning. He recruited scholars from across the Islamic world, built libraries that housed hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, and created universities that attracted students from as far away as Spain and Persia. By 1320, Timbuktu had become synonymous with knowledge and prosperity. But the more successful Mali became, the more isolated Musa felt from the wider Islamic world. Yes, he ruled an empire larger than the Roman Empire at its peak. Yes, he commanded wealth that made him richer than entire European kingdoms. But in the eyes of Islamic scholars in Cairo, Baghdad, and Mecca, he was still just a regional king from a distant land. That perception was about to change dramatically. In 1323, 12 years into his reign, Musa made the decision that would transform him from a successful African king into a global legend. As a devout Muslim, he had always intended to perform the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca that every Muslim is supposed to complete if physically and financially able. For most people, this journey represented a major sacrifice, requiring years of saving and months of dangerous travel. For Musa, the Hajj presented a different kind of opportunity. This wasn't just about fulfilling religious duty. This was about announcing to the Islamic world that West Africa had produced a leader worthy of their respect and attention, and Musa was determined to make an impression they would never forget. The caravan that left Mali in early 1324 wasn't just a pilgrimage, it was a mobile city, a traveling testament to African power and prosperity that defied every expectation the medieval world had about what was possible. Imagine trying to count this procession as it passed by your village. First come the scouts and advance guards, 500 men armed with spears and shields, clearing the path and ensuring safety. Behind them, a parade of camels stretching to the horizon, 60,000 camels carrying supplies, gold, ivory, and everything needed to sustain a population larger than most medieval cities for a year-long journey. But the real spectacle was the human element. Musa traveled with an entourage of 60,000 people, not servants or slaves, but free citizens of Mali. Scholars, merchants, craftsmen, musicians, cooks, doctors, lawyers, teachers, and soldiers. Each person was given a gold staff to carry, marking them as representatives of the Mali Empire. This wasn't just wealth on display. This was an entire civilization on the move. At the center of this procession rode Musa himself, not on horseback like a conqueror, but in a simple traveling outfit, emphasizing his role as a humble pilgrim. Yet even his humility was spectacular. He carried with him 80 camels loaded with gold dust, each camel bearing 300 pounds of gold. Do the math. That's 24,000 pounds of gold, worth roughly $400 million in today's currency. And that was just his walking around money for the journey. The first major stop was Cairo. And this is where our story takes its most dramatic turn. Picture the scene. It's July 1324, and the greatest city in the Islamic world is going about its daily business when word spreads through the streets that an African emperor is approaching with wealth beyond imagination. The Mamluk Sultan, Al-Nasir Hassan, arranged a meeting with this mysterious king from the west. According to historical records, when Musa entered the Sultan's palace, he carried gifts that left the entire court speechless. Not just gold, but artifacts that demonstrated the sophistication of African craftsmanship. Intricate metalwork, beautiful textiles, carved ivory pieces that showed artistic techniques unknown in the Middle East. But here's where Musa's generosity became almost supernatural. Instead of negotiating trade deals or forming political alliances like a typical monarch, Musa simply gave things away. To everyone. Constantly. Without any apparent logic or restraint. He gave gold to the poor in the streets. Not small coins, but handfuls of gold dust worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. He gave expensive gifts to scholars, merchants, government officials, and random strangers who showed him hospitality. When he visited the Great Mosque of Cairo, he donated so much gold that the mosque's treasury overflowed. When he stayed at inns, he tipped the staff amounts that were literally worth more than the buildings they worked in. The Egyptian historian Al-Umari, writing 12 years later, was still amazed by what he had witnessed. This man flooded Cairo with his benefactions. He left no court emir nor holder of a royal office without the gift of a load of gold. The Caravan made incalculable profits out of him and his suite, in buying and selling and giving and taking. They exchanged gold until they depressed its value in Egypt and caused it to fall in price. Think about what this means. Gold was the foundation of medieval economics. Its value was supposed to be stable, universal, and unchanging. But Musa gave away so much gold in Cairo that he single-handedly caused massive inflation. Suddenly, everyone in the city had gold, which meant gold wasn't special anymore. The price of everything else skyrocketed as merchants demanded more gold for their goods, knowing that gold was now common. But this was only the beginning. From Cairo, Musa's caravan continued east toward Mecca, and at every stop along the way, the same pattern repeated: overwhelming generosity that left local economies reeling. In Alexandria, Damascus, Medina, and dozens of smaller cities, Musa distributed wealth with such abandon that he disrupted trade relationships that had been stable for centuries. The pilgrimage to Mecca itself was relatively straightforward. Musa performed all the required rituals, prayed at the holy sites, and conducted himself with the proper humility and reverence. But even in the holiest city of Islam, surrounded by pilgrims from around the world, Musa stood out. His simple clothing couldn't disguise the fact that his modest entourage still included thousands of people and dozens of camels loaded with gold. More importantly, the connections he made in Mecca transformed how the Islamic world viewed sub-Saharan Africa. Scholars and merchants who met Musa returned to their home countries with stories of a sophisticated African empire that rivaled anything in the Middle East or Europe. These weren't tales of a primitive kingdom stumbling into wealth, but reports of a highly organized civilization with advanced administration, impressive architecture, and genuine intellectual achievements. The return journey showed Musa at the height of his strategic brilliance. Having made his point about Mali's wealth and sophistication, he now focused on building long-term relationships that would benefit his empire for generations. He recruited architects, scholars, and craftsmen to return with him to Mali, promising them generous salaries and the opportunity to work on ambitious projects. In Cairo, he commissioned the construction of a madrasa, an Islamic school that would serve as Mali's embassy to the Islamic world, where future Malian scholars could study and where Middle Eastern intellectuals could learn about African achievements. He established trade relationships that gave Mali direct access to Mediterranean markets, bypassing the traditional middlemen who had previously controlled commerce between sub-Saharan Africa and the broader world. But perhaps his most brilliant move was architectural. Musa convinced Abu Ishaq es-Saheli, the renowned Andalusian architect, to return with him to Mali. Es-Saheli would go on to design the Great Mosque of Timbuktu and other buildings that demonstrated Islamic architectural principles adapted to African conditions and materials. These weren't crude copies of Middle Eastern buildings, but innovations that showed how Islamic civilization could flourish in different environments. By the time Musa's caravan returned to Mali in late 1325, he had achieved something unprecedented in medieval politics. He had transformed his empire's international reputation through pure demonstration of capability rather than military conquest. European maps now showed Mali as a major power, with Musa depicted sitting on a throne, holding a golden orb, labeled as the richest king in the world. But the most profound change wasn't in how outsiders viewed Mali. It was in how Mali viewed itself. Musa had proven that an African empire could command respect on the world stage, that Islamic scholarship and African resources could combine to create something genuinely impressive, and that wealth was meaningless unless used to build lasting institutions and relationships. But every legend has its shadows, and Musa's unprecedented generosity came with consequences that would haunt the global economy for years and reveal the dangerous power of uncontrolled wealth. Picture yourself as a merchant in Cairo in 1325, 1 year after Musa's visit. The gold you stockpiled, thinking it would hold its value, is now worth a fraction of what you paid for it. Your business, built on stable exchange rates between gold and other goods, is in ruins. Your family's savings have evaporated. This wasn't a natural disaster or a war. This was the unintended consequence of one man's religious journey. The economic chaos Musa had unleashed wasn't limited to Egypt. Trade networks across the Mediterranean, Middle East, and North Africa operated on the assumption that gold maintained consistent value. When that assumption collapsed, the effects rippled through every market from Venice to Baghdad. Merchants who had contracts based on pre-Musa gold prices found themselves unable to honor their agreements. Banks that had loaned money against gold collateral faced massive losses. Entire trading companies went bankrupt. Al-Umari's chronicles record that the gold market didn't recover until 1334, 10 full years after Musa's pilgrimage. Think about that timeline. A single person's actions caused a decade of economic instability across 3 continents. This wasn't just wealth. This was a weapon of mass economic disruption, wielded not with malicious intent, but through sheer innocent generosity. Back in Mali, Musa faced his own reckoning with power. The success of his pilgrimage had made him a global celebrity, but it had also created expectations that were impossible to sustain. Islamic scholars now looked to Mali as a major center of learning, expecting the same level of patronage and support that Musa had displayed during his journey. European merchants arrived seeking trade relationships, assuming that Mali's wealth was unlimited and freely available. The internal pressures were even more challenging. Musa's own people had witnessed their emperor giving away fortunes to foreign strangers, while they continued to work the gold mines and salt deposits that generated Mali's wealth. Questions arose that had never been asked before. If the emperor could give away 24,000 pounds of gold without thought, why were ordinary Malians still struggling with basic needs? Musa's response revealed both his wisdom and his limitations as a leader. On one hand, he understood that sustainable prosperity required more than just distributing wealth. It required building institutions that could generate and maintain prosperity over time. He invested heavily in education, infrastructure, and urban development. Timbuktu and Gao became major centers of learning that attracted scholars from across the Islamic world. The University of Sankore in Timbuktu housed over 25,000 students at its peak, making it one of the largest universities in the world. But these achievements came at a cost that Musa hadn't fully anticipated. The transformation of Mali into a global power required constant diplomatic management. Every neighboring kingdom now saw Mali either as an opportunity to exploit or a threat to contain. The Songhai Empire to the east began challenging Mali's control over important trade routes. The Moroccan sultanates to the north increased their military presence along the Sahara trade routes, hoping to capture some of Mali's wealth. More troubling were the internal contradictions that Musa's success had created. Mali's economy was fundamentally based on controlling scarce resources, gold and salt. But Musa's pilgrimage had demonstrated that these resources weren't actually scarce for Mali. They were abundant to the point of creating problems. This abundance paradox meant that Mali's wealth was simultaneously its greatest strength and its most dangerous vulnerability. The final crisis came in the form that Musa least expected: imitation. Other African kingdoms, having witnessed Mali's rise to international prominence, began launching their own ambitious projects designed to capture global attention. The Kingdom of Ethiopia increased its diplomatic outreach to European courts, emphasizing its Christian heritage as an alternative to Mali's Islamic identity. The Swahili city-states along the East African coast expanded their trade networks and began presenting themselves as the true centers of African sophistication. Most dramatically, the Kingdom of Congo began its own program of wealth display, sending embassies to Portugal and Rome loaded with ivory, copper, and exotic goods. These kingdoms understood what Musa had proven. In the medieval world, perception often mattered more than reality, and a carefully orchestrated display of wealth and sophistication could transform international relationships overnight. For Musa, this competition presented an impossible dilemma. He had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams in establishing Mali's global reputation, but maintaining that reputation required constant escalation. Each diplomatic encounter, each trade relationship, each scholarly exchange was measured against the legendary standard he had set during his pilgrimage. How do you follow an act that crashed the gold market for a decade? The answer, ultimately, was that you can't. In his later years, Musa focused increasingly on internal development rather than external display. He established legal codes that balanced Islamic law with traditional African customs, created administrative systems that could govern his vast empire effectively, and invested in agricultural and technological development that would sustain Mali's prosperity without depending entirely on gold exports. But the fundamental contradiction remained. Musa had become so successful at demonstrating Mali's wealth that he had made it impossible for Mali to ever appear wealthy enough. Every subsequent display of resources would be compared to the legendary pilgrimage, and every future Malian ruler would be measured against the impossible standard of the king who made gold worthless. Mansa Musa died sometime between 1332 and 1337, leaving behind an empire transformed and a world that would never quite recover from his generosity. But what kind of legacy is that? Was he history's greatest philanthropist, or its most disruptive economic force? The immediate aftermath of his death revealed just how profoundly he had changed everything. Mali remained prosperous and influential for another century, but no subsequent ruler could match Musa's combination of wealth, wisdom, and sheer audacity. The empire gradually contracted as neighboring kingdoms filled the power vacuum left by Musa's impossible-to-replace presence. More significantly, Musa's pilgrimage had fundamentally altered how medieval societies thought about wealth, power, and international relationships. Before 1324, wealth was largely about accumulation and display. After Musa, the standard became not just having resources, but using them in ways that commanded global attention and respect. The long-term historical impact extends far beyond economics. Musa proved that African civilizations could operate as equals on the global stage, that Islamic scholarship could flourish in African contexts, and that true power came not from conquest, but from demonstrating capabilities that others couldn't ignore or dismiss. His legacy influenced everything from Portuguese exploration of the African coast to the development of European trade relationships with West Africa, but perhaps the most complex aspect of Musa's legacy lies in what he revealed about the nature of wealth itself. In a world where most people struggled with basic survival, Musa possessed resources so abundant that they became meaningless through generosity. This wasn't just economic policy, this was a philosophical statement about what wealth should accomplish and how power should be exercised. The modern relevance is impossible to ignore. In an era when global wealth inequality reaches levels that would have amazed medieval observers, Musa's example raises uncomfortable questions about the responsibilities that come with extreme wealth. What obligations do the richest individuals have to use their resources for broader social benefit? How do we balance accumulation with distribution? And what happens when individual wealth becomes so concentrated that it can disrupt entire economic systems? Musa's story also speaks to contemporary debates about cultural representation and historical perspective. For too long, medieval African achievements were marginalized in historical narratives that focused primarily on European and Middle Eastern developments. Musa's pilgrimage proves that sub-Saharan Africa produced leaders and civilizations that were not just competitive with contemporary powers, but superior in many respects. Yet even as we celebrate Musa's achievements, we must grapple with their contradictions. His wealth was built on controlling scarce resources, maintaining trade monopolies, and managing labor systems that, while not chattel slavery as Europeans later practiced, still involved significant social hierarchies and economic exploitation. The gold that funded his legendary generosity was extracted by workers whose names history never recorded. This moral complexity makes Musa a perfect historical figure for our current moment. He wasn't a simple hero or villain, but a leader who achieved extraordinary things while operating within systems that created both opportunities and injustices. His story challenges us to think more sophisticatedly about power, wealth, and responsibility. So what's your verdict on Mansa Musa? Was he the greatest philanthropist in history, using unimaginable wealth to build institutions, support learning, and demonstrate that generosity could be a form of soft power more effective than military conquest? Or was he an economic disruptor, whose well-intentioned charity caused a decade of financial chaos that harmed ordinary people across 3 continents? Maybe the real lesson is that those two descriptions aren't contradictory. They're the same story told from different perspectives. Musa's pilgrimage succeeded precisely because it was so excessive that it couldn't be ignored, dismissed, or forgotten. He achieved his goal of making Mali a respected global power, but only by wielding his wealth with such force that it disrupted established systems and created new problems even as it solved old ones. In the end, Mansa Musa remains one of history's most fascinating figures because he embodied the ultimate paradox of power. The more effectively you use it, the more dramatically you reveal both its potential and its dangers. His caravan didn't just carry gold across the Sahara. It carried questions about wealth, generosity, and responsibility that we're still trying to answer 700 years later. What do you think? Would you have made the same choice as Musa did? Knowing the economic chaos they would cause? How do we balance the desire to do good with the responsibility to avoid unintended harm? Let me know in the comments below. And if this incredible story of medieval economics and African power amazed you as much as it amazed me, subscribe for more untold histories that challenge everything you thought you knew about the past. Because here's the thing about history: the most important stories are often the ones that make us question not just what happened, but what it all means. And Mansa Musa's legendary journey is definitely one of those stories.